I'm going to start the event because I've only got an hour and 4 quite brilliant speakers to hear from today. So I'm going to move on, and if people who are joining as we speak, then welcome. So my name is Nikki Marsh, and I am the Associate Dean for Research and Enterprise at the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Southampton. And I am also the Director of the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities. And this is one of our first events of this year. And I'm very privileged and proud to have such an amazing array of speakers to talk to it. So this event is part of our first series of webinars called Reset 2021 that examines the role that arts and humanities can play in responding to the policy challenges that the radical changes that took place in 2020 are already starting to bring about. Many of these challenges are also, not coincidentally, obviously, the thematic challenges that the Centre of SEA's first year as a research institute. So we're focused on understanding how the arts and humanities research can support our economic and cultural and social recovery from the pandemic. We're focused on analysing the challenges and opportunities that are vital but also troubling with our relationships with technology that have never been more physically apparent to us than now. On making apparent the importance of our cultural responses to the inequalities and uncertainties of climate change, and also on responding as advocates and allies to the facts and histories of inequalities that are becoming ever more present. This first event explores specifically the policy challenges of regeneration for arts and humanities scholars, creative practitioners, cultural organisations and advocates. COVID-19 has revealed how central and vital the arts and the creative and cultural sectors are to our lives, but also their fragility. And as we see these sectors re-emerge in different forms, sometimes with different names in our own city, we thought it'd be useful to open up that question of what does it mean to use culture to support regeneration, to develop economic and social resilience, to build inclusive and diverse and connected communities. So we're asking who and what is included in this process and who and what risks getting left behind. What kinds of culture gets privileged and why? How do we demonstrate the effects that culture, both its presence and its absence, has on our community without losing or distorting its originality, its spark, the thing that makes it itself? Before introducing our first speaker and handing over to our panelists, I want to do two quick housekeeping things. Firstly, I want to mention our missing speaker. Louise Smith, the Deputy Director for Arts and Libraries at the DCMS, isn't able to be here today because she went and had a baby instead. So I just want to send her all our best wishes and hope that coming out of lockdown and those first weeks are working well for her. And secondly, I just want to mention the kind of rules of engagement of this session is the event is going to be recorded so it can be watched and shared again, but attendees' cameras are off and so that you won't be appearing in the recording. We invite everyone to put their questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar, and I'll curate them and direct them to our panelists after they finish speaking in the second half of the event. And for this event, that Q&A replaces the chat function, so that won't be working. I'm going to introduce each speaker separately before they speak, but we're going to take all 4 of their contributions together and then move over to the discussion part. So our first speaker, I'm very excited to be able to introduce is Claire Whitaker Obe, who many of you might know because she's leading the Southampton City of Culture bid. Claire has 25 years of experience in the culture sector. She was the owner director of live music producer Sirius and is currently a trustee of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, an ambassador for the Mayor of London's Cultural Leadership Board, a member of the Arts and Creative Industries Advisory Group for the British Council, a committee member at Astor Group, is on the Music Education Advisory Committee for the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, and an industry champion for the Creative Industries Federation. I'm very lucky to have her expertise today. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me here to speak. Thank you to Nikki for a lovely introduction. Yes, I'm Claire Whitaker and I am the bid director for Southampton's bid to be UK City of Culture in 2025. And I've got a background in producing live events, mainly around music and performance for the last 25 years. But I've been very, very interested as part of that journey in events which can have an impact either socially, culturally or economically beyond the sum of their parts. And I suppose some of the most notable events I've been involved in include the EFG London Jazz Festival, which comprised over 280 events in 68 venues for a live audience of over 100,000 every year in London in November. And also a programme called The Streets, which was a programme of free events in shops, high streets, restaurants, bars, community centres and libraries, which had a really tangible effect on the income and profile of its partners. And interestingly, Shanine Bethina, who I worked with at the GLA on that event, is the current artistic director of Coventry's UK City of Culture bid. And also Culture East, another programme I developed with the GLA, which was to highlight the culture and economy of East London. It was a focus on unusual places and spaces, independent shops, as well as museums, arts venues, etc. And we really looked at how we could get audiences to move around that area of London and incentivise them to spend money as they moved. So that really gave an economic impact to that programme. But I'm going to tell you a little bit now about City of Culture, because the City of Cultural programme has regeneration right at its heart. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So what is UK City of Culture? Well, it's a designation given to a city in the UK for a period of 1 year. And its aim is to give other cities the opportunity to experience similar success to Liverpool, which was European Capital of Culture in 2008. And it's administered by the DCMS. The economic impact for Liverpool when they were European Capital of Culture was over £754 million worth of economic impact. And Hull had huge success with visitor numbers doubling and huge crowds for their events. And very importantly, 9 out of 10 of their residents engaged with a cultural events programme, including a volunteer on every street. So our objective is to win this competition and to use culture to address some of our social and economic challenges in the city. So what is the bid process? Well, it's seen as a very important element of our recovery from COVID-19. Because it's a galvanising force for economic and social recovery post the pandemic. Our bid is going to be defined by our community, and we have actually, it's now over 128 hours of focus groups have taken place, and we've been working very closely with both Southampton and Solent University on that programme, led by Professor Fraser Sturt, who has been absolutely fantastic. And I really do believe it will be the most in-depth consultation process that has been undertaken by any City of Culture. And in terms of our city survey, 82% of respondents supported our bid to be UK City of Culture. So we have a fantastic base to build on in the city. So what would winning of UK City of Culture do in terms of the effect it would have on the city? Well, as I've said, it would really aid our recovery in the context of COVID-19. It would put us on the wider region on the map nationally and internationally. And this is really important because Southampton has some fantastic ingredients, but I often say that we haven't quite made the cake yet. And that's what I hope that this process would do for us. It would generate huge economic impact and create a really huge advantage, which would attract further investment. We've been so pleased with how the city and the wider region has responded to the opportunity, and we've already had huge fundraising success. So the city is really coming together to make the most of this opportunity. It would raise aspirations and skills in our workforce and lead to the establishment of new businesses and quality jobs. And again, that's going to be so important post-pandemic. But also the City of Culture process can really create civic pride and a really strong sense of place, identity, wellbeing, and a sense of community cohesion. One of the things that we've really noticed in the consultation so far is that we definitely have a talent drain in the city and in the wider region, in that people come here and study, but they don't often stay here as much as they do in other places, make this the place that they start their business, where they live and work. And that's something that we really want to address. And the place-based work around the bid can really help transform a city. And in Southampton, there's lots of very exciting plans already, but resources are short. And I think if we won, then we would really have the opportunity to put cultural regeneration at the heart of Southampton. And we really want to look at transforming attitudes and perceptions of Southampton and the wider region, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And that's why the legacy programme is so important. Next slide, please. So in terms of our plan, we wanted to look at what the successes of Hull was. They were UK City of Culture in 2017. And that's probably the closest comparator to Southampton because our populations are so similar. The social impact in Hull, they had a hugely positive schools programme. They had 56,000 young people taking part. And as I say, more than 9 out of 10 residents engaged. And they had a lot of media coverage for the city, which all went to generate more income and more sustainability for many of their businesses. Next slide, please. So what would it look like for us? Well, if we're looking at Hull statistics, the value of tourism went up hugely. There was over £18 million of GVA to the local economy, 6 million visitors, 800 new jobs, 1 in 4 businesses grew, and it really triggered a lot of investment from Arts Council and from National Lottery and from trusts and foundations. And certainly Paul Hamlin Foundation is one of the trusts that have been very supportive of the City of Culture process. And this is all possible for Southampton if we were to win. So what timeline are we looking at? Well, essentially we're waiting now for the guidance, but our bid has to be in by the end of December. And then we get visits from the judges and we have to do a big presentation. So we're working on quite a defined timeline now, with the announcement being made in May 2022, which will be the last month of the Coventry's delayed City of Culture for 2021. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to, most of all, we want to win and to deliver a successful winning bid. We want to have listened to our local community. And as I say, our consultation process has been really, really thorough, and use the things that we've learned from that process to shape the programme, to develop engaging and transformational content, but also to address the economic growth of Southampton, because we need to use our bid to be UK City of Culture as a key driver to post-COVID prosperity. We want to create and are creating a sustainable commercial model, which will mean that our bid is competitive, but also will be able to develop a meaningful legacy. We're looking as part of our economic development at bettering our tourism, culture and heritage strategies. Southampton hasn't had a destination management plan for some time. And the process, in the City of Culture process, you have to have a compelling narrative around tourism. And other cities that haven't won but have still done good bids, such as Plymouth, have still received significant investment. So I think that's something we need to bear in mind, whatever the result. And we need to ensure that the effective winning benefits our wider region. Our partnerships across the region are developing and are very important to our story. So that's a quick run through the City of Culture process. I think that one of the things I've seen and that we have to be very mindful of is that we make sure that artists and cultural organisations that come on this journey with us are not then the victims of any economic success going forward. I've seen that quite a lot in London, where artists have been part of the story. They've helped generate investment. They've helped change the look and feel of a destination, but then they've been priced out of that region, of that area as a result. And I'm very, very keen that artists and creative organisations are embedded into our long-term vision and are given some protection so that they are not just there for the short term, but are actually part of our long-term success. But I've seen for myself how culture can really contribute economically and help transform a place. If you look at the National Circus School in Hoxton and how that really helped regenerate that area, you can see culture making an economic impact at its very best. But that's for me now. I know there's lots of other speakers and I look forward to taking your questions later.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you, Claire. And as I said, that there's a Q&A session that attendees who are watching this should be able to direct their questions to Claire through there. I'm going to move on and introduce our next speaker, which is my colleague and co-conspirator in the creation of Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities, Dr. Daniel Ashton. Dan is Associate Professor of Cultural and Creative Industries and co-director of the Transforming Creativity Research Group at the Winchester School of Art. He has presented and published on the relationship between the creative industries, entrepreneurship, and culture-led regeneration. I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Let me just share my screen for a moment to start off. Great, so hopefully you can see the first slide there. So thank you to Sia for the invite and to Nikki for that warm introduction and to all the panelists for their contribution. I'm going to respond to the theme under the title of From Interventions to the Oblique, Finding the Role of Culture in Regeneration Through the Ordinary, Everyday and Unexpected. As cultural theorist Raymond Williams famously said, culture is ordinary. So culture is all day and every day. Culture is for and by everyone. Here we can look to live streaming from the Royal Opera House, to the artworks of rainbows and candles placed in windows in homes across the country, to the 15-second TikTok videos created, played and shared on phones. To turn to another cultural theorist, Stuart Hall examined culture as a site of interpretive struggle, a site of critical action. Here we might look to the Black Lives Matter movement and the Martin Luther King series, and the objects and actions on the street, the posters, the banner, and the act of taking the knee. So in addressing the role of culture in the development of local and regional economies, there is a lot to refer to, a lot to connect with, a lot to prioritize. So taking the inspiration from Williams and Hall, my suggestion here is not to overlook how culture is ordinary and how culture is a site of interpretation and struggle. So what does this mean for exploring how culture connects with regeneration and pressing issues around equal access and participation in civic life, the precarity facing businesses and freelancers, and the changing nature of the places where we live, work, play, make, and consume? Well, culture always has a role. It couldn't not. The more precise question concerns the interventions that can be made. This is part of a well-established approach that has been described as the policy of attachment, in which arts and culture attach and are attached to a range of public policy objectives, including health and well-being, social inclusion, and urban regeneration. It's within this framing and context that the need for measurements and metrics arises, especially in the case for investment in cultural organizations and program cultural activity. So this is where it would be possible to reference a diversity of case studies and reports to show how cultural organizations have tirelessly and imaginatively engaged in this call to lead and support regeneration. But to reconnect with Hall, there is a struggle over meaning when it comes to cultural regeneration. One place to see a different perspective on cultural-led regeneration and the struggle over meaning is with Jonathan Mead's critique in the 2007 documentary On the Brandwagon, the Regeneration Racket, in which he sardonically questioned how multi-faith street furniture and creative cluster hubs could be triggers of enterprise. And he described these interventions as oblique. Mead also raises important issues around the politics of regeneration, planning and development, who is doing it, why, and who benefits. But noting the reset theme of this SEER series, I'm less concerned with rehearsing existing critiques and instead want to shift perspectives and look to the openings and possibilities that come with seeing culture as ordinary and a site of critical action. So culture attaches to policy objectives, but what about a purposeful detachment? Can we assume that the multitude of impacts and benefits of culture will be there without making these the explicit outcomes and the basis for measurement? So this doesn't mean replacing the policy of attachment with the culture for culture's sake argument. Rather, I'm wondering about how public policy goals, such as regeneration, might already be core motivations and increasingly embedded within cultural businesses and organizations. And most specifically here, I'm thinking of the 36 business plans from Winchester School of Art students I had the pleasure of exploring and marking in January. These business ideas spanned fashion rental platforms, digital publications, networks for supporting aspiring creatives, and educational digital games. The importance of meaningful relationships to place were at the heart of their business ideas, values, identity, and activities. Issues of social justice were often front and center. In many plans, environmental sustainability features in what students will make and do and how they'll operate. These are visions for culture that are inclusive. They're also switched on to the joys of cultural creation and experimentation and the development of new services, products, and experiences. So these are students that I've worked with, but there are so many creative entrepreneurs and practitioners creating new visions for what culture can be and how it can implicitly stimulate regeneration. So was Meads onto something when he cynically called cultural-led urban regeneration interventions oblique? Lots of reports do show an impact. However, part of the challenge, and perhaps what makes them oblique, is tracing this causal effect. So what if we pause on the emphasis on explicit interventions and causal effects and regard oblique as a good thing? Culture as a catalyst of unanticipated, unexpected, and serendipitous, but powerful and transformative regeneration. Culture can be oblique, so can cultural-led regeneration be oblique? So cultural-led regeneration is perhaps one of the most prolific areas in which we see what Jamie Peck has described as fast policy, in which policy lessons derived from one place are reformed and transformed elsewhere. But there are numerous long-standing examples from Cardiff to Cork to Helsinki, where dominant models of cultural flagship buildings and festival and event regeneration do not proceed as anticipated, and where fringe groups question and challenge official versions. So what can happen when the ideas and activities come instead from what is in place? So to finish up, as cultural theorist Jack Halberstram encouraged, we have to untrain ourselves so that we can read the struggles and the debates back into questions that seem settled and resolved. In a world navigating the ongoing impacts of global pandemic, this is a compelling call. When it comes to culture and regeneration, perhaps we should not ask what culture can do for regeneration, but what the regeneration of culture can do. So in closing, some considerations for today. To remember that culture is ordinary and culture is a site of critical action. To remember that culture can be oblique. It has impact, but measuring these is a different matter. And emerging cultural and creative businesses, if supported in doing their thing, have impacts. Their cultural products, services and experiences might not easily be located within existing models and frameworks of regeneration, but they can be transformative. The needs are urgent, but let's create space for the unexpected. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That's really, really valuable. I love the idea of the unexpected and the ordinary as we're preserving what we're doing with culture. I think there's lots we can talk about there. I want to move on, and please, again, Dan, questions for Dan can come into the chat. To introduce our third speaker is Gerald Vernon Jackson at the CBE. Gerald is a member of the National Executive of the Liberal Democrats and has been a councillor in Portsmouth since 2003. He was the leader of the council from 2004 to 2014 and regained that position in 2018. As part of it, he is responsible for Portsmouth International Port, the largest in the country, and also director of Portico Shipping. Since 2017, Gerald has been chair of the LGA Cultural Tourism and Sport Board and a member of the LGA Executive, and also sits on several key bodies. He's a vice chair of Key Cities, a director of the Solent Local Economic Partnership, and a member of the Tourism Alliance Board. He's worked for organisations including IDEA, Solace, Leadership Centre, ALDC, and Westminster Foundation for Democracy. And we're very lucky to have Gerald today because it's also election season, and he is in the middle of all kinds of events, as you can imagine, and he has to rush straight from this at the end of this to go to the Falklands virtually. So thank you, Gerald, for your time today, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, Nikki, thank you very much. Actually, the main bit of what I have to do today is deliver leaflets because postal votes arrived today, and and I have to get elected to keep my job. So thanks very much for inviting me today. And I've just got a few little bits and pieces I hope to say about this. We've been asked to look at the questions: what does culture and the creative industries more broadly play in development of local and regional economies? How can culture achieve change? How does it change? Who does it change and how? And what and who is included when culture is used to support regeneration? I'm sorry, I don't have slides, so you're just going to have me. So I think they're interesting questions that we've asked. In my view, the answer is a very significant one. Before the COVID pandemic, the cultural sector and the creative industries were part of the fastest growing part of the economy, creating more jobs than any other part of the economy. The creative industries, about £115 billion of economic activity. That's huge. And I think one of our problems has been that we've talked about the arts in the past. And I think one of the things we need to be thinking about in the future is talking more about creative industries, because that's the sort of thing that interests people in Treasury, because it's about creating jobs and wealth. And if we're trying to get Treasury interested in investing, they're not interested in the arts, they are interested in industry. So economic growth figures can be incredibly valuable in advocating for the value of creative industries, but a wide range of local outcomes sits behind them. For example, a thriving visitor and nighttime economy, which has a massive impact on supply chains in hospitality and leisure, or increased footfall on high streets supporting the retail offer. And then there's the wider social outcomes linked to good cultural provision. During the pandemic, we've seen how vital cultural activity can be underpin health and well-being, contributing to better mental health and educational outcomes, while supporting our connections with others and our sense of community cohesion. In turn, community well-being supports higher rates of productivity amongst those in work. So culture has a vital role to play in creating vibrant places to live and work. And the benefits of investing in culture can be complex and far-reaching. If companies are looking to relocate, they don't just look at the workspace that's available, but they look to see if it's an attractive place for people to want to come and work for them. And the cultural offer is really important as part of that mix. So I've seen that firsthand here in Portsmouth, and we've deliberately invested in heritage as part of our regeneration strategy in the city. For over 2 decades, we've led or supported cultural investment to transform the closed areas of the naval base into major visitor and employment hub. This has seen the development of the iconic Spinnaker Tower, Gunwharf Quays Retail Unit, the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and now the Mary Rose Museum. We get 9 million visitor days a year of tourists coming to Portsmouth. This has created hundreds of new jobs. So it's a very, very important part of what we do. But we've not just done that, we've looked at other things. At the moment, we're in the process of buying the freehold of the new Theatre Royal to be able to rescue that from going bust. The City Council bought the King's Theatre to stop it becoming a pub and has invested in that. We've turned old gun emplacements into the hot walls of studios, workshops and retail outlets for local artists in Old Portsmouth. We've doubled the number of artist studios that we own and run at ArtSpace, and that's been hugely successful. We've supported the Victorious Festival taking place on Southsea Common every year, not only with the 30,000 people who come to that, but also the support that that festival puts into local artistic groups and Portsmouth Creates. So this is a group called Portsmouth Creates, which we've set up to pull in funding from the Arts Council, from charities, from local organisations, and they've been supporting artists around Portsmouth. And one of the things they did last year, just before Christmas, was they took over a disused Debenhams store to run it as a market for creatives, so that people could sell their work. And people were telling us that they made more in those 2 weekends than they made in the whole of the rest of the year. So councils can have an incredibly important part in what happens with the cultural industries in their area. I've learned that partnership is key and that culture and heritage has to be central to regeneration efforts. It isn't decorative icing to put on the top of an existing project. It works best when it's embedded in the objectives from the start, because it's how culture exists in people's lives. This has really been brought to the fore during the lockdown. We've seen how important culture can be in keeping people connected and creativity engaged. Culture and heritage organisations were among the first to meet the challenges of COVID-19 by embracing digital solutions and reaching out to vulnerable or isolated communities. For example, Kingston Library's online rhyme time sessions reached over 10,000 viewers. Slunglow Theatre Company in Leeds asked for contributions of artwork from local people, which were displayed on lamp posts across the city, engaging with a completely new audience of local people. Gem Arts in Gateshead put together a simple creative arts pack to send to the members of one of their health and wellbeing groups. Oh, sorry. Next, and B Arts in Stoke delivered bread to local families along with art activities and stories for children. Culture and creativity really matter in people's lives. This is something we need to understand as leaders as we move into recovery from COVID-19. Cultural regeneration is not just about creating shiny cultural infrastructure. It's got to be inclusive and respond to community needs. The Local Government Association published a report on cultural regeneration in 2019, which highlighted some excellent case studies illustrating this, which is available on the LGA website. Councils have an important part to play in this agenda. They're currently the biggest national funder of culture, spending over £1 billion annually on the arts, heritage, museums and libraries in England, way more than the Arts Council. Councils currently run 3,000 libraries, have more than 350 museums and public archives, support 116 theatres, numerous galleries and art centres, and are responsible for many monuments and historic buildings. They provide core funding for many more. But council budgets are increasingly under pressure as a result of the pandemic and rising demand from services like adult social care. Maintaining support for culture will involve working creatively in partnership with the cultural sector and other important local stakeholders like higher education, institutions, health and the community sector in place to make sure every penny counts. This is going to be a real challenge. We all know that last year was incredibly difficult for all businesses and organisations, but cultural and creative industries have been one of the hardest hit sectors of the economy. Government support programmes like the Furlough Scheme and the Cultural Recovery Fund provided a lifeline for many organisations, and we also know that the hardest period may be yet to come as organisations begin to reopen their doors and bring back staff. In spite of this, I believe culture has a major role to play in our recovery as a nation. And finally, on Southampton's bid to be City of Culture, we've been very, very happy as Portsmouth to support the bid from Southampton on the basis that in 5 years' time, Portsmouth will do so and Southampton will back that bid. So that what we're trying to do is not rather to complement each city and work in cooperation, not to work against each other. So thanks very much for the invitation to come to speak, and I hope that's of some interest.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Gerald. And there are questions appearing in the chat, and it's really important to remember the role that councils play in supporting culture that I think we don't always keep in mind. I'm going to move on and introduce our very last speaker, which is Catherine Clark. Catherine is Professor and Director of the Centre of the History for People, Place and Community at the Institute of Historical Research, the School of Advanced Study and the University of London. Catherine's research interests include heritage in placemaking today, and she has led several projects linking research, creative practice and urban regeneration. She's currently co-investigator on the AHRC funded project Towns and the Cultural Economies of Recovery, and full disclosure, so am I should say that there. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you very much, Nikki, and it's a real honour to be speaking at the first of these SEER webinars. What a brilliant programme you have lined up for us. So yeah, as you heard from Nikki, my interests are in the intersections between culture and heritage and placemaking. And my own way into today's questions has been through my research and collaboration with creative practitioners and local governments on a number of different regeneration and regional development projects like these ones here. Developing places starts with celebrating the local and specific, grounding sustainable development in an understanding of place and identity, and making those distinctive stories visible, crucially through co-production with local communities. Culture and heritage obviously play a key role here. But there are still gaps in higher level national policy in understanding the needs and cultural identities of places beyond the metropolis, particularly smaller cities and towns. Just this morning in the news, I see Tony Danker, head of the CBI, has noted that levelling up across the UK won't succeed as a one-size-fits-all approach. It has to be grounded in an understanding of local places, their distinctiveness and their assets. Local culture and heritage, I would argue, must be a key part of that. So, how can culture achieve change in our places? As you just heard from Nikki, that's something we're examining closely in an AHRC funded research scoping project, Towns and the Cultural Economies of Recovery. It's led by Nikki as PI. We're particularly interested in culture in the government's Towns Fund and Levelling Up agenda. And those are great case studies for examining the role and the perceived role of culture in regeneration and development. The Levelling Up prospectus, published with the budget back in March, presents cultural investment as one of 3 themes in the first round of the fund. With the Towns Fund, we're looking at the town investment plans submitted by the 101 eligible towns to see how those towns proposed to use culture to drive local development. What kinds of evidence did they point to for the impacts of culture in local regeneration? How will they measure its value? And our project's already pointing to challenges around the kinds of data we use to measure and evaluate the impact of culture. Can we go beyond metrics and quantitative data? What new tools and vocabularies do we need? I was looking at the Measuring What Matters report from the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and interestingly, it highlights what it calls a mismatch between what people at a local level see and feel is important and what funders, often are to remove, actually want to measure. What I loved about that report is it suggests some new principles for measurement in the future. And it suggests one of these principles should be measurement which will provide inspiration rather than standardization. I really loved that as a new model for measuring the impact of culture. It's the thick concepts like hope, pride, participation, which are really key to developing our places. But how do we measure progress in those? It's a real challenge. And I suppose the flip side, crucially, to thinking about how we measure the impacts of culture is what kind of resources beyond the purely financial does culture and cultural transformation need in order to happen? How can we better identify, value, and nurture those local networks, capacities, and varieties of expertise? How have those resources been affected by COVID-19? The question of who is involved in delivering local regeneration through culture is something we're paying a lot of attention to in our Towns project. Cuts in local government and in cultural and heritage services have left some challenges around the capacity to deliver some of these very ambitious regional development schemes. There are some research and skills gaps. Consultancy firms rolling out similar solutions across the UK, volunteers stepping in to meet local needs. We're seeing fascinating local volunteer networks and geographies around individual charisma and enthusiasm. The expertise and energy of communities is central here. It's a huge asset. But of course, we also have to think about who's not there, who's left out, and what's sustainable. The arts and humanities have so much to bring to the table in terms of our understanding of place, identity, story, and imagination, as well as our toolkits for varied kinds of engagement and facilitation. We know, for example, that creative practice and creative formats can do things and reach participants other forms of policy debate and public discourse can't. So I think there's a really interesting picture here of questions, gaps and needs, but also exciting opportunities for thinking innovatively about culture and regeneration, especially for me, in very locally inflected ways. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. I think Anna's going to bring all of our all of our speakers back now, so we can all ask each other questions and have a conversation for our last 20 minutes or so. I'm gonna start because I think that's my role here. And my question is, we've got Bournemouth being represented by Catherine and the Towns Project on the one hand, and then we've got Southampton by Claire, and we've got Winchester we've got the whole region. Is there anything specific? One of the questions that we have, I'm on a consortium of local universities and we're thinking about culture here, is in naming our region and defining what our region is in terms of culture. And it stretches from kind of Bournemouth to Portsmouth up to Winchester, that kind of triangle, and the Isle of Wight as well, of course. In terms of kind of culture and regeneration, do we know what we are? Do we know how we can give ourselves a presence? That would be my kind of first question for you, whether you have any thoughts on what makes us specific. What are the challenges that we face that are specific? We're very mixed as a region. We're industrial, we're rural, we're coastal, but we're seen to be relatively wealthy in terms of the levelling up debate, because we're seen to be in the central south, and we're perhaps we need to kind of articulate ourselves in new ways to compete against the national agendas that are looking, as we know, at the Red Wall and are being kind of politically motivated, clearly. So I was wondering, first of all, if you had any thoughts on what it was about our region, that as I've got these kind of amazing speakers, that we could hang on to as a first question. And anyway, who wants to, Claire, thanks.
Yes, I think this is something obviously I've been acutely aware of as I've been building Southampton's bid. Southampton is in the southwest region of Arts Council England. So I'm very keen that our bid is framed within the Solent region, which I think is increasingly understood, and with free ports, I think is going to be examined quite closely. And that means working very closely with our neighbours. So I'd like to take up Gerald's offer of exploring how that can look and feel. But I'm very keen as well that Southampton's bid extends its tentacles into the southwest and looks at some regional touring models and regional partnerships. And because of that, we're already working with Poole Lighthouse on a series of projects. So I'm going to be illuminating our Southwest credentials, our Solent region credentials, and working closely with our neighbours.
Thanks, brilliant, Claire. Gerald.
Well, I suppose this is not the audience for it, but slightly cheekily, I always refer to Southampton as a Portsmouth suburb. So we could always think of it as Greater Portsmouth, but that probably doesn't go down so well. No. So Solent, I think, is an increasingly used word. So the economic development arm in the area is the Solent Local Enterprise Partnership. The group that's looking after all the transport models is Solent Transport. And I think we can build on that. Increasingly, Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council are interested in joining all of those organisations as they're intending probably to look more east than west. That they're looking to the other urban areas of Southampton and Portsmouth as opposed to rural Dorset. So we've got a very good triangle of Bournemouth, Southampton and Portsmouth and the areas between them. So I think that's a really good way in which we can build our position. But I think we've got to be very clear that the whole area is not a hugely rich area. It is in some places, but I know in Portsmouth, the city I live in, that if you live in the city centre, on average, you die 10 years earlier than if you live 3 miles away in the suburbs. Now that health inequality is appalling, and it's been there for a long time. So we actually need to be out there getting people to understand that there is inequality and poverty in lots of different parts of the country, and a regional look is really very inefficient. To say that the southwest is very poor and Yorkshire and Humber are very poor, and therefore we can pour lots of money into places of extreme poverty like Cheltenham and Harrogate, misses the point that actually there's poverty spread around the whole country in pockets, and you actually need to address it in a much more sensible and complex way than just a regional thing. This bit's poor, this bit isn't.
Yeah, absolutely, Gerald. And that we can see the ways in which that money, we can see that through the way in which the Towns Fund is being devolved, that there are all kinds of questions that we need to be asking there around who's getting that money and why. Catherine.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'd add that I think we're a strangely kind of liminal region in all kinds of ways. Gerald, I was really interested in what you're saying about Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole starting to look further east, because in various different kind of infrastructural and political maps of the UK, sometimes Bournemouth sits, alongside Bristol in a map of that region, which is really not where our kind of natural gravitational pull, would take us. Winchester, sometimes seen as a kind of commuter relationship to London. So I think, thinking with the Solent as a way of drawing what Claire described as kind of new geographies and new connections, new ways of configuring relationships between places and opening that potential be really, really useful, because we have these strange kind of disconnections and liminalities that we have to work against.
Brilliant. I'm going to just, my other question here, which I think is kind of coming in through some of the questions that are being asked. Sorry, I've got to kind of flick between screens and it's a bit awkward. Is around the ways in which we've all given, or all of you have given, slightly different ways of understanding, which is really, really productive, what it is about culture that creates some kind of regeneration, or what that regeneration looks like, or what the effects of culture are, because you're coming from such different viewpoints, and that's exactly what we wanted to happen. I wonder if we can reflect a little bit, and you've all touched on evaluation and measurement in different ways as well. How do we measure or understand, and what are the histories of those changes? How do we know what culture has done? And we need to know that, of course, to do the thing that we're all also talking about, is successful lobbying for our region, to make sure that investment comes into the region of the kinds of that we want to happen. So I was wondering if anyone could reflect a little bit on the different kinds of models of metrics, of measurements. We've got Dan's model of detachment and Catherine's model of inspiration. We've got Claire's model, which is very clearly around the framed language of the City of Culture bid, which is about a kind of economic an impact on jobs and wealth, and that Gerald is right in saying that's the thing that the Treasury wants to listen to. That's why we need to think about the jobs that were going to be created. So for how we measure those things, and where the different projects that you're working on has taken us to there. If we could have a minute on that, would be fantastic. Catherine.
Thanks, Nikki. So I'm thinking of a report that DCMS put out earlier this year, which valued the character of local historic high streets at £7.80 to each household per year. And I think we come across, don't we, so many of those very kind of precise financial measurements. And I'm really interested, and our Towns project is really interested in expanding measurement beyond kind of numbers and statistics. There are lots of different possible approaches to this. I tucked a few into my presentation. I know that some of the other ways of approaching this is thinking around, touching on the SIC concepts. I think something you'll think about at Southampton is using UN Sustainable Development Goals, where they're looking at how development advances those, whether there's a way that you can kind of measure success there, growing capacities. Something we're looking at in our Towns project is whether we can use story and narrative both as a tool to kind of envision futures and imagine different possibilities and inform policy, but also can we use it to then reflect on and in some ways evaluate or articulate the impact of cultural change and development. Your stories being used in really interesting ways by organisations like Historic England and Carnegie Trust at the moment. I think one of the real challenges is that my emphasis would always be on the local, but of course national government and funders and policymakers often want very standard, transferable tools for measurement which can be rolled out across the country and scaled, and that's not always the best way to capture change locally.
So I think how we've approached it from our City of Culture bid so far, working very closely with Southampton and Solent universities is to try and get a really strong baseline for where we are at the moment. And I think that has involved probably the largest consultation for a City of Culture project that I've certainly, I was involved in Hull, and I was a bit involved in Leeds 2023, and certainly our process, partly out of necessity, because COVID has meant that we've had to have many, many more small groups. So therefore we've talked to people in a lot more depth. Most of the City of Culture evaluations I've been involved in before involve very large groups of people, you know, split up into tables, therefore 2 or 3 hours, whereas we have done a much more bespoke approach to try and get a deep understanding. And actually, to answer one of the questions in the chat, I think that in terms of COVID, you know, the inequalities in our society have really been highlighted through COVID. And what we've tried to do in our consultation and in our planning for the bid is to make sure that we try and understand those voices that aren't normally heard. We've really had to put in a lot more time and relationship building to talk to communities who may find the whole digital process quite excluding. But I think we've been really quite successful in trying. We also held a consultation in every ward in the city, which I think really made sure that we weren't just looking at it from a city centre centric focus. So we're also commissioning a destination management plan, which again will give us a baseline that we haven't had in the city for quite some time. So I think we will know where we want to build to. And if you add to that the ambition of our programme and and the things that we're planning, I think we'll know where we've started, and then we'll be able to measure very clearly what City of Culture will have brought.
It's really interesting to think that this, and I think we're finding that in lots of ways, aren't we, that this digital technology is creating intimacies rather than just distance that we didn't imagine this time last year. There's a kind of question, Claire, while we're talking about those focus groups and that consultation, which I know is really, really important to this bid, around, is there anything from those focus groups that you'd like to speak to in terms of the kinds of discussions that we're having? Were they surprising, those results? Were they expected? What are they? How are we going to kind of carry those forward?
Well, I think certainly people loved being brought together. Now, I don't know whether that's the excitement of City of Culture or whether it's the COVID situation where people were feeling isolated, but they loved coming together, and they love that. In fact, they want that process to continue way beyond the consultation, which is fantastic. And that sense of collaboration has been absolutely amazing. I think that we were originally not planning to do the ward sessions. We did do the ward sessions, and it was, you know, it's quite a lot more work for the team, and we were so glad that we did, because we found things out about the city that we wouldn't have got through just speaking to some of the more established groups. So I was very, very pleased we did the ward sessions. I think it illuminated that Southampton is really a city of villages. And those villages have very different characters and very different infrastructures and cultural capabilities and cultural ambitions. And I think we will now be able to construct a bid that will be far more representative of the whole city and not just the city centre. And again, just taking one of the other questions from the chat, I think one of the things that we will be able to tackle through City of Culture and the legacy aspect is that for Hull, the team came in after the bid had been won, they delivered the year, and then they left. And it was the team that had done, you know, a lot of work on the Olympics. They did an amazing job. They made a real splash, but they hadn't been involved in that consultation. That programme wasn't what they developed, and they changed quite a lot of it. Our approach is to keep the bid team and the delivery team as close as possible. That obviously will have to get bigger when we win, but we are really looking at keeping a consistency of thought and of ideas and of experience, so that the bid is really reflective of the consultation, and we're building the legacy into that consultation as well. So we're trying to have not just the bid programme, but what the city will look like for the next 10 years after as very much part of our thinking now. And I think that is very different to Hull.
Yeah, and it comes back to not being a kind of victim of your own success here. because there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of excitement around the idea of the city of culture, and then you've created expectations, and whether those expectations are what people want and need seems to be one of the really kind of complicated things that we're discovering in our work around the ways in which communities are involved and not involved. And Dan.
Thank you. I love the point that Claire made there about discovery and how extending the focus groups that took place added to new insights. And I think that's almost perhaps an answer for thinking about measurement and metrics, that they need to be holistic and they need to be expansive. Perhaps it's a little bit obvious to say that we can only measure the things that we look for. So making the space to not be quite narrowly limited to economic and social determinants and factors as already set out, and just creating that space to join all these things up and keep looking. Evaluation has to be an ongoing, iterative, messy process. I think that phrase discovery is perhaps a really nice way of thinking about measurement and metrics. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Gerald, before you have to go to the South Atlantic.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I'm going to quickly try to answer one of the other questions that were directed at me at the same time. I think for me, getting people in government and funders to take the creative industries seriously is really important. I think it was a huge success to get the 1.57 billion during the COVID pandemic, and an enormous credit goes to Nick Sirota and the Arts Council for being able to get government to commit to that, and that was absolutely brilliant. But it's not always the way. I sit on the board of the Solent Local Enterprise Partnership, and trying to get people there to take the creative industries seriously is really tough. Now, I got them to put it in the forward strategy, but it was quite a lot of work to get people to think that creative industries was not just cream teas on the Isle of Wight. So I would plead with people to be involved in things like the LEP. The LEP is open to every company to join, it's free, and then you elect the directors. The moment we don't have anybody from the creative industries there to sit on that board. And likewise with government, I know talking to Tory MPs, that things like working with the words creative industries can work well with some people who don't value the arts for themselves. There are some people who do value the arts, and that's great to have those on board, but we need to build a bigger coalition of people, and sometimes that bigger coalition are people who are interested in economic activity, the jobs that are created, the wealth that's created in the country. So taking that idea of the creative industries as a economic powerhouse for the country and for this part of the country, I think it would be a really important part of how we get that message into government and get the funding that's required to generate those jobs and create that wealth. So at that point, I'm very sorry to say, I'm going to say goodbye and disappear to my next thing. I hope you carry on and it's an interesting continuation of the seminar. And thank you very much indeed for the kind invitation to be involved.
Thank you so much for coming, Gerald. Good luck at the beginning of May. Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
Leaving on the idea that we have to build a coalition is also fantastic as well, because I think that's very true, and part of the coalition, I think, around the creative industries, which works not only for government but in universities, it works in all kinds of contexts, is really helpful to think about that question of the region as well, the coalition that we're going to build in the region. We've got to the end of our hour. I don't know if there's any questions that you wanted to ask of each other, anything that we haven't covered that would be valuable to let our kind of panelists to finish with.
I just wanted to answer Gerald's question about government. So I think because of the Cultural Recovery Fund, and it's a shame Louise isn't here to be able to talk about this herself, but as being on the board of that, I think we do have a unique opportunity to reframe our conversations with government, because they have now got skin in the cultural game in a way that they haven't had before. And they also have a map of our cultural, not all our cultural institutions, because not all of them went for the Cultural Recovery Fund, but they've got a different kind of a map which spans the commercial and the subsidised, the charitable, and all different types of organisations that they haven't had before. And I think that we do have a job of work to do to get the LEP to really understand the potential for the creative industries. And it's been quite interesting because other LEPs around the country, some of them do understand that better than others. So I think that is a very valid point. But in terms of our conversation with government, I think there's a renewed vigour that is possible now, having had all this investment from Treasury. And Treasury have been very, very involved in those decisions and the oversight of them.
Yeah, I mean, there is renewed interest, and there is funding. Kind of what forms that's going to take still worries me. What the kind of the shapes and the assumptions around what culture is and what culture can do there, and who can be included in that culture. I think we have to watch that space really, really carefully. As Catherine said, in our project, what we're discovering is these consultants are in between the DCMS and the spending of this money, and that they're offering, they're offering things that aren't necessarily grassroots. So I think it's a complicated moment as well, as an optimistic one. Okay, I'm going to say thank you very much to all of our speakers, and to say that this is only the first of our webinar series. That we're also having a series on the next session is going to be on lessons from coastal communities. So I think lots of these things that we've started to talk about today, we can talk about there, around what happens in our region, what culture does in our region, what it means particularly to think about it in terms of a moment of economic change and kind of environmental change. And then we're going to have our third session is going to be on equality, diversity and inclusion in the creative and cultural industry. So again, that question of who's included and who's not included is one that we're going to pick up there. So just thank you very much. Thank you for the attendees for staying with us for this hour, and good Monday afternoons to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.